somebody asked, are there modern saints? Are there modern saints? And of course, there are. One is somebody called Jonathan Daniels, that I'll be saying something about next week. And he was born in the 1950s, I believe. He was a seminary student in the 1960s. And he, according to the Episcopal Church, is probably going to be named as one of our saints in the very near future. In fact, I think he already is considered to be one. Archbishop Romero in El Salvador, who lived in, I believe, the 1960s, was martyred in the 1960s. He's certainly a modern day saint. Dorothy Day, who was a social worker, social activist in the Roman Catholic Church. I think she's on the track to being considered a saint. So here are some of the people who are very much modern day saints. So they didn't all live back in the medieval days, and they live at all times. I thought what we do this evening is I'll talk until about 25 after, and then open it up for questions, and then I'll start the second part of the presentation about 6:35 or so. So somebody asked me, what are the qualifications of being a saint? So I'll talk about the Episcopal Church first. And also the question was, who decides? The qualifications are that these are people, in the quoting in the words from the book Holy Men, Holy Women, they are empowered by the Spirit for ministry. Empowered by the Spirit for ministry in diverse settings and circumstances, so all around the world and at all times. They show a diversity of gifts, and they are shaped by God's redemptive activity. So these are the people that are called to be Episcopal saints, empowered by the Spirit for ministry in a variety of settings with a diversity of gifts, and shaped by God's redemptive activity. Now, in the Roman Catholic Church, it's a much more complicated situation. The first qualification is the hardest one of all. You've got to be dead. So if you qualify according to that, then it's a four-step process. And the first step is that an expert person investigates their life, gives a close look at their life, and looking at whether they would be a good candidate for sainthood. Then the second step is a report is sent to their bishop. And what follows then is more study. If the study then is going well for their candidacy, there's a report to the Holy See, to the Vatican, in other words. If approved, the candidate is granted the title the Venerable, the Venerable. So that's the second part of the process. Third part of the process is there's still more investigation. And if they hold up under this additional investigation, they get the title Blessed, the Blessed so-and-so. And one of the things that they're looking for is 2 posthumous miracles. In other words, what they're looking for is that somebody was miraculously healed by praying to that particular saint. So they pray to the saint, there's a miraculous healing. They can believe they can prove it, that it is a healing and that it resulted from their prayer. And that's the third step. And then finally, the fourth step is the person is approved by the Pope and is officially canonized as a saint. So it's a long process. It's a long, involved process. It takes anything from a matter of years to a matter of centuries. There have been saints in the Roman Catholic Church that were canonized centuries after they lived. The quicker example, I think, is St. Francis of Assisi, who I think was canonized 2 years after his death. I don't know whether that can happen nowadays, but it did happen back then. Now, in the Episcopal Church, the question, who decides? Well, first of all, a name is recommended. And this is what happened with Jonathan Daniels, who I was talking about a few minutes ago. Jonathan Daniels, the seminary student who was active in civil rights, was talked about as someone who could be considered for sainthood because he was martyred He was killed defending a young woman who was being harassed by some racists. So he looked like a likely candidate. He was living a holy life. He was an American seminary student in Episcopal Seminary in Boston. And so the first step was that he was recommended. There was sort of a groundswell of recommendations for him. Then the second step is a group called the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music. Looks at the life of that person and investigates their life and recommends them then for inclusion in Holy Men, Holy Women, which is the closest we have to a directory of saints. So then every 3 years, the General Convention meets, and the General Convention approves the latest edition of Holy Men, Holy Women. So that's the process in the Episcopal Church. And we do have one question was, do we have saints' days? Yes, indeed we do. I'm holding up the Episcopal Saints calendar. You can see it on my screen now. And that lists the name of saints. I think the church offices have copies of this, perhaps, if I'm correct. And this week, the week of October 11th, we have a couple of bishops who are remembered on the 14th, today, as a matter of fact. Channing Moore Williams, and another person who were missionary. Tomorrow, Teresa of Avila is the saint. That would be for Thursday. The 16th, Hugh Latimer, who was in the English church. And then on the 17th, Ignatius of Antioch. So this is our calendar of saints. Some of these are Roman Catholic saints, because of course there wasn't any Protestant church or any Episcopal church up until the 1500s. So we inherit the saints that were venerated in the Roman Catholic Church, and then after that we have additional people from our church and also other Protestant churches. So in a nutshell, that's kind of how saints are chosen and what the process is. And if any questions come up, I'll be glad to answer them during the 10 minutes in the middle of the session, starting at 7:25. So let me go on now and talk about our saint for today, which is Saint Benedict. Saint Benedict of Nursia, who is a very, very interesting person. He was a Roman citizen, lived in the 5th century, and he was the founder of the Benedictine order, Saint Benedict. Two things that I find interesting about Benedict, and I'll talk about him in more detail. Two things that are interesting about him. One is he asked a very important question when he started his order. And this is the first sentence in the order, in the order of Saint Benedict. He asked the question, what is a good life? That's a very interesting question. What is a good life? And not good in the sense of goody-goody. I mean, good in the sense of what makes for a reasonable human life. What is a balance of mental, physical, spiritual? How much is spirituality a part of that life? Is spirituality the only component, or are there other things? What is the good life? And that's, in fact, the first sentence of his order, the rule of his order. The other thing that's interesting about Benedict is he lived in a time when society was falling apart. This was the fall of the Roman Empire. And what is one's responsibility in a society that's falling apart? What responsibility does one have? Should you stay around and try to straighten things up in the society? Should you leave and try to invent a more sane way of living? And so his answer to that was to leave and to start a whole new way of living. He was born in 480. 480. So if you know your history, you realize that he was born 4 years after the fall of the Roman Empire. 476 is usually considered the fall of the Roman Empire. So he's living at a time that the Roman Empire is teetering. This is the society that he's born into. Now, like a lot of historical things, the fall of the Roman Empire is a much more complex story than it appears on the surface. Rome was at its height in 117 AD. That was the height of the Roman Empire, 117 AD. So the Roman Empire, at the time of his birth, approximately, had been in decline for 3.5 centuries. That's a long time. That would be as if America started declining around the year 1700, and as if for the last 300 and some years we've been living in a declining society. So that's a long time. Now, granted, things moved much more slowly back then, but still, it's a long time. And in the centuries leading up to his life, things were going very, very badly. This is the time that's called late antiquity. Late antiquity. During this period, there were various civil wars in the Roman Empire. There was huge income inequality. There was inflation, which of course robbed people of their savings. And there were continuous barbarian invasions. So, you know, that old Chinese curse about may you live in interesting times. Say Benedict and his followers lived in interesting times. In 275, now this is a couple of centuries before he was born even, in 275, the Pope left Rome. There was no Pope in Rome after 270. I'm sorry, not the Pope, the Emperor. The Emperor left Rome in 275. So the Emperor exits Rome and goes to Ravenna and starts his court in Ravenna. So there's no emperor in Rome. It's the city, but no emperor. People are beginning to leave the city if they have wealth, if they have means. They're beginning to leave the city and move outside the city. In our own time, the way people are moving into the suburbs because they're leaving the city because they're afraid of the pandemic. So in this case, they were afraid of the disorder. So they left the city, they tended to move into the country, into the hills around Rome. If they were very wealthy, they moved to Constantinople, which was a major city elsewhere in the Roman Empire. In the mid-300s, now again, this is long before Benedict's birth, in the mid-300s, the Roman population, the population of Rome itself, begins to decline. Now, Rome had been a city of about 1 million people. It was large even by our standards. But in the mid-300s, it begins to decline. But then the real disaster is in 410. 410, when Rome was sacked by the Goths. These are not the Goths in our society who wear dark makeup. These were honest to God Goths who came into the city, sacked the city, and they conquered a city which had not been conquered since 387 BC. Rome had never fallen in 800 years. And so for the first time, Rome falls to an enemy. Now, at this point, you've got to ask, what was Rome in the minds of the people? What did it mean to be a Roman? And they would have said, well, what it means to be a Roman is that you're a part of the greatest empire in the history of the world. You live in the greatest and most populous city in the world. You live in a nation that dominates all the known world at that time. That's what it would have been to be a Roman. So when these things are no longer the case, what does it mean to be a Roman? And what I'm suggesting is it calls into question the, the self-image you have of yourself as a Roman. What does it mean to be a Roman if now the city has been successfully attacked by somebody? It's the same kind of crisis of identity that happened to the Jews when Israel was conquered. So they were the people of the land. This was the promised land, and they were the people of the temple. So then what does it mean to be Jewish if you no longer have the land and you no longer have the temple? I think it's also similar to what America went through with the Vietnam War, because part of our identity is that we're the people who always win our wars. And then all of a sudden, we lose a war. And I think part of the soul searching that was going on in the 1960s and 1970s was resulting from the fact that our self-image as Americans was seriously called into question. So that was a great blow for Americans who lived at that time. Life goes on. In 455, the population of Rome, which had been about 1 million, as I said before, drops to between 70,000 and 100,000. That's a huge loss of people. Part of the reason for that is the grain supplies from North Africa. The northern part of North Africa is fertile. North Africa, France, and Spain can no longer provide the grain that the city needs. And so people either die of starvation or they simply leave Rome. In 472, the city is attacked. In 476, Rome officially falls. And what that date suggests is that this is the first, in 476, this is the first non-Roman emperor. So in other words, this is the first barbarian emperor, not a Roman, but a barbarian who was named emperor of the Roman Empire. By 500 AD, Romans are tearing down monuments to use to build churches. So they're tearing down pagan monuments to build Christian churches, and the Christian church is beginning to do very well in 500 AD. Now remember, Christianity was officially accepted as the religion of the Roman Empire way back in 313. So the church was well established. So what you see now is you see the secular society going into a tailspin, and you see the Christian church beginning to emerge in power and take up a lot of the slack from the Roman Empire. The century goes on. Now remember, 500 AD, this is when St. Benedict is 20. 526 is the end of, trying to read my own handwriting here. I'm sorry, I can't read it, but something happens in 526, sorry. 535 to 554 is an absolutely horrible time because there's an ongoing 20-year-long civil war that goes on up and down the Italian peninsula between the Emperor Justinian and the Ostrogoths, more Goths, who are trying to establish themselves in Italy. During this long civil war, the city is contracting in size by 90%. The land area of the city reduces by 90%. The city is now 10% of its size in terms of land area and 10% of its population. One estimate puts the population of Rome at 500. Now remember, it had been 1 million. 500. There's food shortages. There's malaria appearing in the lower elevation areas of the city. By the end of the 500s, two of the 13 aqueducts are no longer functioning, so it's hard to get water into the city. And finally, in 563, um, the Pope takes over the city leadership of the city itself. Remember, the Pope is gone, the Emperor is gone. The Pope now takes charge of what is left of the city of Rome, and now the Pope is in charge. So I'm going to take a break at this point now. It's 7:25, so we'll second part of Saint Benedict. Let me, before I get into his life, let me just say one thing about the end of the Roman Empire, and that is that if you could time travel, if you could go back to that period and talk to somebody in the street and say, could you tell me what it's like to live in these last days of the Roman Empire? If you could ask that question, they would say, last days of the Roman Empire? What do you mean, last days of the Roman Empire? The Roman Empire is still going on. And they'd say to you, well, you know, we've had our problems and uh, some quite serious problems, but the Senate still meets. The Roman Senate is still meeting. Um, the emperor is still in charge, even though he's not in Rome anymore. He's in Ravenna, but we still have an emperor who's in charge. We have the Circus Maximus and the big, public displays that go on there. We have the games at the Colosseum. That's still going on. And in fact, it went on until 540 AD. The Roman baths were still there. And so they'd say to you, what fall of the Roman Empire? We're still going on. So I think it's sort of interesting to realize that people living in a certain era don't really know the historical moment. We think it's so obvious to them. But I mean, for them, life just goes on, and maybe there are some troubles, but you know, they wouldn't see it the way we do as a decline. They'd see it as the Roman Empire going on, um, and some problems going on at the same time. But let me get now into the life of Saint Benedict, which is a very interesting life. So remember, Benedict is born in 480. Roman Empire has officially fallen in 476. He grows up in Rome between 480 and 500. So he'd be 20 years old at 500. He's got a girlfriend. He's got a girlfriend in the city. So they dated or whatever young people did during that time. However, Rome at this point is, as you can imagine, is pretty chaotic with all the food shortages, the growing water shortages, people leaving the city, barbarians at the gate, that sort of thing. It's kind of a crazy place to live. And I'll read you a short passage from a book called How the Irish Saved Civilization, which is a wonderful book. And it's telling the story of one of the saints of the church, St. Augustine, who's living in Milan in the year 386. So this is like a century before Benedict. But what he says is he speaks of rioting and drunkenness, chambering and wantonness, strife and envying. So that's the life he knows in the city of Milan 100 years before Benedict is living in Rome. So probably life during that time was pretty chaotic. So Benedict has a choice at this point. Benedict, age 20, says to himself, this is no way to live a life. This is absolutely nuts. So at this point, the choice is, does he stay and try to, make life better in Rome? Or does he say, this is beyond hope, I'm out of here? And that's exactly what he does. He says, I'm out of here. 20-year-old Benedict leaves the city, leaves the girlfriend, goes 40 miles to the east, and takes up residence in a cave. So he discovers this cave, in Subiaco, which is 40 miles east of Rome. He brings with him a person who is described as his nurse. That's what the early translations say, his nurse. But Benedict, being 20, probably what this was a family servant who came along to be a companion and to help him along. So he and this companion establish themselves in this cave, and he lives in this cave for 3 years, between 500 AD and 503 AD, between the ages of 20 and 23. So he lives in the cave. It turns out there's another monk living on the next hill or whatever, and this other monk comes over and gives him food and helps him out and so forth. So there finally grows up a little community. And during this time, Benedict is obviously saying to himself, how should people live? What is a sane, reasonable kind of human life? he's he's thinking about this in his own mind and trying to figure this out. In 530, now he lives there for several decades. He gathers a little group of would-be monks nearby. So he and this small group are living there. They're beginning to practice a kind of services, a kind of piety. And they're living together and trying to support themselves in this life away from the city and away from all the craziness of the city and the collapse of the city of Rome. So 530, he relocates, he and this small group, they relocate to Monte Cassino, where they establish a Benedictine monastery, which actually survived until World War II, when it was tragically destroyed during the war. But they moved to Monte Cassino. He's 50 when they move. In 547, at the age of 67, he dies. And so at this point, he has gathered around him a group of men, like-minded men, who want to serve the Lord, who want to live holy lives, who want to live reasonable lives away from the craziness of the dissolving Roman Empire. Now, the question you have when you're founding a monastery and talking about living in community, the question you have is a very obvious question. What do you do? You know, I mean, you don't have to go to work. You don't have a job you have to go to. You're not raising a family, but you've still got 24 hours in the day and you're awake for 16 hours out of 24. So the question you have immediately is, okay, so here we are living together, trying to be holy. What should we do for 16 hours a day? So this is where the rule of St. Benedict comes in. And he starts the rule with a sentence that says, is there anyone who yearns for life and desires to see good days? Is there anyone who yearns for life and desires to see good days? So in other words, what he's saying is, who out there wants to live a reasonable, sane life? You know, and that's a very good question. I mean, that's the question that people always ask themselves. So in the rule, he divides it up into work and prayer and study. Work and prayer and study. Work is manual work for about 5 hours a day. And remember, they have to take care of themselves. I mean, there aren't paid employees to come into the monastery and wash the dishes. Everything that they do is on their own shoulders, and it takes a lot of work. So 5 hours a day is doing various kinds of manual work, cooking, cleaning, repairing, making clothes, making wine, undoubtedly, all the things that have to be made and done when you're living together in a community. It's 5 hours a day. Prayer and liturgy are 5 to 6 hours a day. So by prayer, it would be the services. Monastic services are generally held throughout the day depending on the order, 4, 5, 6, 7 services during the day. So whatever you're doing, you break off, you go into the chapel, you pray in the chapel, pray the Psalms or whatever form that takes, and then you go back out again and do the work you're doing. And then the last part of this is studying, 4 hours a day of studying. So this would be reading the Bible. It would be reading holy books, spiritual books. So you've got work about 5 hours a day. You've got prayer and liturgy 5 to 6 hours a day. You've got study 4 hours a day. And the whole emphasis of the rule is balance, moderation, and reasonableness. Balance, moderation, reasonableness. At a time when these words, these practices were totally missing from the larger society. Balance, certainly no balance. Moderation, certainly no moderation. And reasonableness, not the insanity that was going on in Rome, which was falling apart at that time. So that's what they do. They start the order, and the order becomes extraordinarily attractive to people. People are attractive to the order. I mean, totally different from nowadays, when I doubt that any member of the family, of the church, actually knows somebody who lives in an order. Maybe 1 or 2 people do. But for most people, they don't have the experience of even knowing somebody that lives in a religious order. In those days, in the early Middle Ages and into the Middle Ages, being in an order was a highly attractive thing to do. People flocked by the hundreds into the various orders, Franciscan, Benedictine, Cistercian, and the various other ones. So there was something extremely attractive about this way of life. And part of the attractiveness, undoubtedly, was the fact that it was an ordered life. You actually had some stability. You actually had some protection from all the craziness that was going on around you. And it was a very, very attractive life for many, many people. So Benedict, as I said, dies in 547. Half a century later, some Benedictines go to England. So they travel to England and they bring the Benedictine practices to England. And they establish themselves there. In a century or two, they go back to Europe and establish themselves throughout Europe. And the amazing thing about the Benedictines is the fact that their practices survived for 1,000 years. Think of anything that lasts 1,000 years in society. The Benedictine rule and the Benedictine way of life prevailed from 500 AD, when it was established, to 1500 AD, to the end of the Middle Ages. And even you could say nowadays it still remains, because there are still Benedictine orders in the Catholic Church. And our own Episcopal Church, remember they went to England, our own Episcopal Church has much of its teaching and much of its emphasis on a balanced life from the Benedictines. So they were they were highly influential in terms of their effect on Christian thinking. So it's a great success story, and this all goes back to this monk Benedict who looked around Rome in the year 500 AD and said, "This is absolute insanity. This is absolute craziness." So the thing that's interesting, and I'll open it up to questions in just a minute. The thing that's interesting about Benedict is, by choosing to become irrelevant, I mean, he took a hike. He went away from Rome where the problems were. By choosing to become irrelevant to his society, he ended up being extremely relevant to the society that followed. Because he was, in a sense, he was the one who saved Europe, because it was the monastics during the Middle Ages who provided the structure and the stability that carried Europe through the Middle Ages. And much of that resulted from people like Benedict, who started it in the first place. So it's an interesting fact that by choosing to become irrelevant to his society, he ended up becoming extremely relevant to the society that followed. So let me open it up to questions at this point, and questions about Benedict or the order or anything else. It's yours.